Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Momentous days here in Israel with the ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza, and also momentous days in the U.S. and for the entire world, dare we say, with the inauguration of President Donald Trump. We're going to be breaking it all down with Israel Policy Forum's very own Chief Policy Officer Michael Koplow and Shira Efron, IPF's Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Director of Policy Research. Will the ceasefire in Gaza hold? Will all the hostages come out? Will Gaza ever not be run by Hamas? And will Trump pressure Netanyahu, or will Netanyahu try to run circles around Trump? It's a new day with a lot of new questions, and well, also some old questions, but a lot of new questions too. Let's get to Michael and Shira. Hi, Michael. Hi, Shira. Happy New Year, and welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Neri.
Thanks, Neri. Hi, Shira.
Thank you both. Happy New Year. I think we're still within the the expiration date for Happy New Year greetings. And before we begin, a little bit of administration issues are in order. First off, we're recording this late Monday night Tel Aviv time, and Donald Trump has just been sworn in as the 47th president of these United States. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. And second, we should give Shira her flowers, as the kids say. At least I think that's what the kids say. Last episode, before the holidays, she said that a Gaza ceasefire for hostage deal was a distinct possibility. Michael, you and I were a bit more skeptical, it's fair to say. And obviously it happened. So well done, Shira.
Yeah, kudos to Shira.
Thank you. Finally, I was good about something positive.
Well, you were right, and it just happened to be positive. You can also be right about something that's negative, and
thankfully, I was right. And
a lot easier to do.
Yeah,
exactly. It's a lot easier to do in this part of the world. But we have to get into it. The first topic, the obvious topic. Yesterday, the ceasefire came into effect in the Gaza Strip. The guns fell silent, and three remarkable Israeli women, Emily Damari, Romi Gonen, and Doron Steinbrecher, were released and are now back with their families safe and sound. Really remarkable last 2 days. Michael, let's start with you. What were your initial reactions or thoughts when you saw the images of these three women being transferred from Qassam Brigade, Hamas custody and captivity into the Red Cross, and then obviously into IDF safe hands and back to Israel?
Obviously, a great image to see, a great thing that had happened. I'm not surprised that Hamas chose for the first wave of three women who seemed like they were still in okay condition. I do worry about what we're going to see going forward, but these three were in okay condition, and how can anybody not rejoice at seeing them come home? I mean, it's really amazing. On top of that, though, my other reaction is this was months after it should have happened. They shouldn't have been there for this long. By all accounts, this was the same deal that's been on the table effectively since May. It's the alleged, or I should say, supposed Biden parameters that weren't really Biden's, but Bibi Netanyahu was happy to have Biden's name on them instead of his own. This deal was on the table, and this could have happened months ago. So it's great that it's happening now. Obviously, better late than never. I am hopeful that when more hostages come, and I think it's going to be a pretty agonizing 6 weeks where, it's a drip, drip, drip of hostages. We had 3 yesterday, and we're not getting another 4 until Saturday. So, a week in between. But I hope that the next rounds of hostages that come home are alive and in similarly good shape, and that they can start to heal their lives and move on, as can Israeli society. And it's going to be, I think, very difficult, as I'm sure we'll speak about, to keep this deal going and hold it all together. But in terms of yesterday, I think yesterday was a day to celebrate without qualification.
Definitely a good day. And yes, they seem to be in fairly remarkable physical condition for 471 days in captivity in the Gaza Strip, and also emotional condition, psychological condition. Obviously, we don't know, but also they seem to be doing okay as far as these things go, coming out of Hamas captivity. Shira, same question to you. What was going through your mind when you saw the powerful images from yesterday? Fair to say there wasn't a dry eye in much of Israel.
There wasn't a dry eye in much of Israel. Seeing those young, beautiful, heroic, young women smiling and going home and reuniting with their families, with their mothers at first. And you saw it, and I mean, we can be cynical about it, but even those who voted against the deal seemed to not. I don't
be taking credit
in their mind, but the warm welcome, because this is a crappy deal, and we can talk about why it's so bad, and the fact that it was on the table. It's the only deal possible, but it doesn't mean it's a good deal, right? But the fact that those young women kidnapped, two from their beds essentially, and one from the Nova party, are back home and healthy. And I'm not even starting to think about those hostages that were going to be on this list, right? Had this been signed earlier in May, and I'm hearing that this sort of like the framework of this agreement actually has been around for almost a year now. So too late, but hopefully not too little. I will say, I don't know, for those viewers, there were 3 hostages that came out yesterday, right? Doron Steinbrecher, Romi Gonen, and Emily Damari. And it's interesting, to me at least, it looked to me as Romi and Emily seemed in a little better condition than Doron. And it turns out that Romi and Emily were held together, and most of the time they actually spent in an apartment. And Doron was in the tunnel the whole time. And, I don't know anything. I didn't speak to the families, right? Just from one view, I mean, what it takes on their bodies and their souls. And let's just hope this is the beginning in what's probably going to be a long recovery process. But they have the whole lives ahead of them. And this is terrific. And we're waiting for the next round, which is another problem with this deal, right? It's like the salami slices every week, 3 to 4 hostages spread out, with plentiful dangers to those who are there, right? Every day there is a risk to their lives. And so at this point, I think it's a roller coaster of emotions, being finally having some tears of joy, right, Neri, in a long, long time in Israel, but also anxiety, fear, understanding this is really a precarious moment in time.
Very precarious. And even a few hours ago, there was already disagreement between Hamas and Israel over when the next hostage release would take place. Like you said, it was supposed to happen this Saturday. 4 women hostages were set to be released, but now Hamas says it's going to happen on Sunday, and Israel came back and said no, that would be a violation of the deal. So hopefully the mediators can troubleshoot that issue and get them out when they're supposed to get out. But just another indication that every day something can come up, and this is a very complex deal, as I got into it with Shani last week's episode. Very complicated deal. Not just hostage releases, but also Palestinian prisoners being released, IDF withdrawals, and the like. We'll get into it in just a second, and we have to keep that in mind. And like Michael said, this is quote unquote the good period. I think the first couple weeks will be much more positive because, as per the agreement, the living hostages are taking precedent and will be released first. But on the back end of this 6-week first stage, not all the hostages set to be released are going to be alive, and we have to be prepared for that. Us and the Israeli public have to be prepared for that. But undoubtedly, yesterday was a good day, and I think it just goes to show, well, we knew it, but it's worth emphasizing that it just goes to show, especially the decision makers here and around the world, you can kill whoever you want, every terrorist in the Middle East, and it doesn't actually equal even 3 courageous women being released from captivity in terms of the Israeli public's emotional reaction. And we know that for a fact, firsthand, Shira, just being here. It's not even a comparison. Not even a comparison. Let's get into the brass tacks, shall we? The deal itself, which Shira alluded to quite eloquently. Crappy deal.
Salami.
If you want to get into the salami, yes. Well, some of us like salami.
Don't knock salami. That's a great deli sandwich. Come on.
I'm a vegetarian.
It is a great deli sandwich. Well, there you go. There you go. The details, we're not going to get into all the details, but we do know, just back of the envelope, it's going to be a 6-week ceasefire, 42 days in this first stage. 33 Israeli hostages set to be released. Over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, likely more, will be released from Israeli jails. And the IDF will gradually withdraw from Gaza's urban centers back to the buffer zone on the Israel-Gaza frontier. And crucially, also the 2 big and strategic corridors of Netzarim and Philadelphia. Just a remarkable deal. Shira, like we alluded to at the top, you were less surprised by this deal, but were you still surprised by the details and the fact that Bibi Netanyahu actually agreed to this deal after, like you said, many months of rejecting a lot of these conditions that Hamas had put, that he eventually relented and agreed to?
I mean, essentially, Netanyahu gave up on every supposedly red line that he had, right? What it's territorial compromises, right? In terms of territorial, it's Gaza's territory, but the Philadelphia corridor, the Netzarim corridor that bifurcates southern Gaza or northern Gaza from the rest of the Strip. Obviously, even the humanitarian aspect of the deal, which no one even paid attention to, is a very big jump in terms of a very big concession in terms of what Israel was willing to do until now, and happy to talk about it because I think it's not as spoken. 600
trucks a day.
600 trucks, beginning of rehabilitation, rubble removal, which means you have to get bulldozers into Gaza. I mean, there is stuff there. Reopening Rafah crossing for exit of civilians and injured fighters. What are fighters? Fighters are Hamas militants. I mean, there's a lot there, but and of course the prisoners you mentioned, we're talking about, I think, close to it, and there's a strange key determining how many Palestinian prisoners for every Israeli. If the Israeli is, you said 33 Israelis, but it's Israelis living hostages, but also deceased ones, those who died in Hamas, and
also female soldiers, and
so
female civilians,
right? So there's this legend, right? And how many Palestinian prisoners is worth every Israeli, depending on the category, but it could be up to close to 2,000 prisoners. And the types of prisoners,
right?
Those are heavy prisoners serving life sentences for murdering Israelis. So Netanyahu, Mr. Security, total victory. We're not going to stop until all the way to the end, and then you stop very, very short of the end in a deal that is, as we said, it's the only deal possible, and it's a deal that we should have done. But there's no point. I don't think there's a positive spin to be put on it. It's a terrible deal in everything he does. And my main criticism, and I think Neri, we spoke about it. Maybe it wasn't you, and I'm just like rubbing in the "I told you so." But I spoke with someone on Saturday before the deal was implemented, and I said, "I bet you tomorrow, 8:30 a.m., which was the ceasefire going to start, Hamas is going to be back in uniform." And I got pushback, and even before the ceasefire went into effect, they were back in uniform. So I think, from my perspective, the prisoners, IDF withdrawing from Gaza, which in a sense I don't think is a bad thing, right? But Rafah reopening, and we can speak. There's actually a positive thing. We are all in favor of increasing humanitarian assistance to Gaza. So these are things that I don't have a problem with. But if this deal is done only to have Hamas be the de facto governor of Gaza again, because Netanyahu all this time refused to speak about the day after alternative to Hamas, this is the not a total victory. It would be a total failure.
So hold that thought about the day after. It's a good thought, and we'll get into it properly in just a second. And it wasn't me that you were talking to on Saturday. I would have remembered that conversation.
Okay.
But yes, the I told you so is from Shira Efron. I do remember. Michael, what did you think last week about this deal as the details became clear and reported publicly, although not by the Israeli government, by the other actors, and the fact that Netanyahu agreed to all these things?
It's obviously a really steep price to pay in all sorts of ways. So first and foremost, of course, the prisoners. I think the numbers that we've seen are, and you can correct me if I'm getting them wrong, but I think it's 737 prisoners from before,
security prisoners,
right? Security prisoners, and then it's 1,100 and change Palestinians who've been arrested since October 7th. Huge numbers now,
but not. Critically, not Gazans who were involved in October 7th.
Right.
Yes.
No Nukhba terrorists. And so it's obviously a huge number of people. The 1,100 plus who've been swept up since October 7th. There's no way of knowing from the outside who's in that group, and whether it's people who really should not be released or people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And obviously, the IDF was not being very discerning in terms of who they were picking up. But the security prisoners, there are going to be some really horrible people in there, and that's of course going to be a problem. And undoubtedly, some of them, maybe even most of them, are going to return to terrorism once they're out and about. And so, the price of this is going to be felt by Israelis for a long time. That doesn't mean that it's not worth paying, given that we're talking about Israeli civilians who have been held in Hamas tunnels for over a year, but it's a pretty steep price. So that's one aspect. And then you get to, as Shira noted, all of the things that Netanyahu at various times either promised he was never going to do or said that these things were so critical to Israeli security that they could never be negotiated away, such as Israel's presence on the Philadelphia corridor, such as turning over the Rafah crossing. All these things that were supposed red lines that would be fatal to Israel's security, all of a sudden, when Netanyahu's politics change and when he's getting heat from Donald Trump, all of a sudden these things are no longer as important. So, of course, there's that aspect of it too. And in some ways, it's hard to judge those, whether it's a bad deal or not, because who knows how important they ever were to begin with, or how much Netanyahu just elevated them as political talking points. So there's that part of it. But the part that concerns me the most is that, particularly for those of us who have been urging this now for months, and all three of us wanted to see this deal, what I worry about is that because Netanyahu and the Israeli government did nothing to pave the way for the day after, in some ways this deal is set up to fail. Like the reason that the three of us know that Hamas is going to be returning to governance in places in Gaza, and the reason they're out there on the streets, and the reason they're now walking about in their uniforms as if they own the place, it's not because the IDF didn't kill lots of them, and it's not because the IDF didn't do a good job militarily. It's because, as we've been saying for over a year, if you don't prepare for something to replace them, then nothing's going to replace them. They're just going to stay. And I'm just already waiting for the folks on the right who oppose the deal to later, whether it's days or weeks or months, turn around and say, see, look, we told you so. This deal never should have happened. It was too risky. It was too dangerous. We should have been pushing forward until we got to our nitzachon muchlat, until we got to our total victory. And given the choices the Israeli government has made, obviously total victory is not a real possibility, but given the choices they've made, even accomplishing the things that they want to accomplish now that the deal is in place isn't possible, because, as we've been saying, if you refuse to talk about the day after until the day after is actually here, then there isn't going to be a day after. And so I'm worried from a substantive point of view that this deal is set up to fail from the beginning. And I'm also worried from a just political perspective that the real extremists are going to get a win out of this politically, not because they've been right on the substance, but because this was, we're now sitting here in Donald Trump's America again. So, I can use his terminology. This was rigged, right? It was rigged from the beginning. And Netanyahu would, I know we're certainly all expecting this, in days or weeks or months from now, him starting to walk it back also and claim that he never really wanted it and he was coerced into it, and he was forced by Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Benny Gantz and whoever else. That's where this is leading. I mean, we can we can talk about predictions that are right or wrong, but on this, it's so clear and obvious that this is what's coming down the road. So I hope that the deal lasts, again, because these hostages have to come out and there's no other way to get them out. But I am already steeling myself for the anti-deal folks to say, oh, take a look, the deal was a failure, and it's just going to be because of things that the Israeli government refused to do before the deal was implemented.
So a little bit of a pushback, because politically it's this government who agreed to the deal. He can't blame Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz or whoever else. It's their deal. It's their cabinet who overwhelmingly agreed to it.
I mean, Neri, how's that going for this government taking any of the blame for October 7th when they were in power?
Fair point. But I think it is interesting that if you follow, like I have, the right-wing kind of pro-Bibi media ecosystem, such as it is over the past few days, they were in shock on Wednesday. They couldn't believe that these were the details of the deal, and some of them regrouped valiantly and tried to spin it and say, well, Netanyahu is a grand chess master and we don't really understand all the ins and outs. And others were arguing that, well, Donald Trump will obviously let us go back to fighting after 6 weeks, and so we have to be patient. But others were pretty candidly and openly critical of the deal, even very pro-Netanyahu mouthpieces in the media here. And obviously Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, or former national security minister, resigned on yesterday, and pulled his Jewish Power Party out of the government. Now, you can say a lot about Ben-Gvir, but at least he had the courage of his convictions and resigned, unlike Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, we should say. And if we're talking about flowers, we should also give flowers to our dear friend Tal Shalev, who 2 weeks ago on this very podcast predicted that this deal would, quote unquote, be within Smotrich's red lines, and that he would not quit the government. Tal was right. I was actually skeptical even back then, whether that he would actually stay, and she was right. So all I'm saying is that there will be a big decision to come in 6 weeks, right? And then we'll be a lot smarter. Going back to the day after issue, which you both mentioned, what would you have liked to see? Shira, we'll start with you. What would you have liked to see the Israeli government put in place? Obviously before yesterday, before the ceasefire went into place, obviously maybe a year ago, in terms of preparing for a day after. So maybe we wouldn't have seen those images of the Qassam brigades popping back up in uniforms and masks and Kalashnikovs. Although, frankly, I think that would have happened regardless. It was almost inevitable, but maybe the Israeli government could have put in a process, or begun a process for the day after. Is that fair to say, Shira?
Okay, just right before I get to what we should have done for the day after, I think it's I do think it's important that this deal could collapse before we come to the 6 week mark, because on day 16 of the deal, negotiations are supposed to start on phase 2, and I think that if you look at the stages of the deal, we're not going to go into the minutiae of the details, but Hamas rips a lot of the benefits in the first 4 to 5 weeks of this deal. And there's not going to be an incentive for them to finish the last deal, where it's going to be, I think, 14 hostages, probably, bodies at that point.
The last week, yeah.
The last week.
Yeah.
So things could unravel even before. And I agree with the political analysis and the calculations here. Now, what should have Israel done? I think it shouldn't have come from Israel, to be honest. I think where Israel was supposed to agree to have the conversation of a day after. It's a farewell to the Biden administration. They did really, I think, the best that they could to change the situation, and maybe it's not their fault that it didn't work as well until Trump is claiming credit for the hard work that they did. The thing is that I think there was a lot of talk about a two-state solution, a lot of talk about we will do this deal will get us to a diplomatic political vision, but no one did the actual work. We spoke about it a lot, right, Michael and I, and we even had an article about this. There was this assumption that someone will we'll get to an agreement, which we all, as we said, could have been done 6 months ago, if not 12 months ago. Get to an agreement, and somehow from that agreement, all the domino tiles are going to fall into place, and we'll have a two-state solution and normalization with Saudi Arabia. There is so much work that needed to be done in terms of strengthening the Palestinian Authority, putting leverage on the Palestinian Authority to reform for real, but also having the not just the capacity, which they don't have, but also the interest and understanding that they have to do the hard work of unifying with Gaza. There were a lot of ideas on how to start piecemeal with the Palestinian Authority. We spoke about, we never thought they can't just take over all of Gaza. We thought that as the IDF takes over a small territory and clears it from Hamas, then you can transition responsibilities to the PA, both functionally in a gradual way, but also geographically, right? Building the capacity, building trust again with the local population, having them distribute the humanitarian assistance, turn it into an economic project also for the West Bank. We spoke about having them man crossings. Remember J-Lots, the pier? This is stuff that the U.S. could have done. Israel opened all crossings only in response to U.S. pressure. So this extra pressure could have come also with and make sure you have Palestinian Authority, customs and border police there at the border. So I can go on and on and on, but I think there were different small steps that could have been, in a creative way, paving the way towards some sort of a day after that would have been imperfect, but would start seeding the seeds, putting the onus on the PA to prove, right, that it's capable and willing, but also showing the Israelis that the sky doesn't fall when you bring the PA back into Gaza in a formal way, because the PA is actually in Gaza already, just no one admits it. This was not done, unfortunately, except a component of this deal that does bring the PA in, and we can talk about it. And we're left with those images of Hamas feeling comfortable at home and de facto controlling, because that's, there was a vacuum that was created when Israel sought to dismantle them, and this vacuum is clearly refilled by whatever's left of Hamas.
But Shira, you know as well as I do that the barrier to the PA, at least being allowed to come back into Gaza, was the Netanyahu government, who didn't want to hear it. They said, no Hamas, no PA, no whatever else. And so you're left with nothing. And then you cut a deal to at least pause the war. And obviously Hamas will pop back up and regroup. So I don't know what more could have been done.
It's obviously, it was the Netanyahu government that vetoed this. But now we're seeing that there are ways to put pressure and demand things of the Israeli government, like Steve Witkoff did, right? Which can talk about the big game change here was the fact that you have a new president of the White House, and you can say Netanyahu is more scared of Trump than of Smotrich. It's all true, but there were ways to do these. There were times earlier in this war when Israel was really. Israel really cared what the Biden administration thought earlier on in this war. And when the Biden administration, I think, and the Europeans and the Emiratis and all Israel's partners in this war and could have demanded more. And maybe Israel would have said no, but the main thing that Israel said no to is like any of these discussions. And I think it's less discussions and more actions.
Okay. We'll be right back after this brief message.
On Sunday, January 19th, Israelis and Jews around the world rejoiced as Emily Damari, Doron Steinbrecher, and Romi Gonen returned to Israel and their families after over 15 unimaginable months in Hamas captivity. We applaud the hostage and ceasefire agreement that secured their release and that of 30 other hostages. At this pivotal moment that could mark the beginning of the end of the war, Israel Policy Forum experts are providing timely, trustworthy analysis. Against the backdrop of the ceasefire in Gaza and President Donald Trump's return to the White House, Israel Policy Forum has published our recommendations for the new administration and Congress, aiming to stabilize areas of conflict while creating a foundation for new diplomatic and political horizons. These recommendations address 4 key areas important to the U.S., Israel, and regional partners: security assistance, West Bank stability, Gaza, and regional security and integration. A link to this resource can be found in the show notes of this podcast. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
Michael, what did you make of the Hamas guys popping back up, the vacuum that they're now refilling in many parts of Gaza, and like we're talking about, the abject lack of any day after planning or even just tying it to this ceasefire deal?
So, of course, they're popping back up. We know there are still Hamas fighters in Gaza. The question isn't why are there any, right? I think the open question still, at least for me, is how many of them there are and where are they actually in control and how much support do they have? There were interesting pictures circulating on social media yesterday where you see the videos of people mobbing the Red Cross vehicles and surrounding Hamas fighters, and it looks as if there are thousands and thousands of people out there cheering, and then you see photos from above where it seems that these images were pretty closely engineered, and it's actually not very many people at all. So I think it's too early to say, but Hamas fighters emerging from Nasser Hospital. Wow, what a shocker! So that part didn't surprise me. Nothing actually. It's not just that part. None of this surprised me. In terms of how we got here, I mean, this is literally what the Israeli government has wanted. They've not just prevented a day after plan from being implemented. They literally refused to have any discussions about it for months and months and months, on the theory that you can't possibly discuss the day after until the day after actually arrives, which was complete nonsense from the jump. And we're seeing now exactly why that is nonsense. So, could the Biden administration have pushed more? Could other parties have done more? Sure. Ultimately, this is, aside from the failure to get hostages back until now, between November 2023 and yesterday, aside from that, the central failure of the Israeli government, to me, is preventing any possibility of anything replacing Hamas. So, of course, this was going to happen, and people can try to do now whatever they can in this period, but ultimately, the things that we have been talking about and writing about, all three of us now, for well over a year, about what has to be done to set up a security force, about what has to be done to start to figure out governance, all of that shouldn't have waited, and it did. And so here we are. In a perfect world, once the hostage and ceasefire deal was announced, you would have had an outside non-Hamas and non-IDF security force that was ready to go into Gaza immediately.
Bingo.
And as the hostages were coming out, they would have moved in. But that doesn't exist, and it's not going to exist now for months. Even if there was complete agreement today to do that, it would still take 4 months to identify and train and equip and get these guys back into Gaza. So, by the time any of this stuff happens, we're gonna be well beyond stage one of this deal, if it gets beyond stage one, or, as Shira said, even if it gets to the end of stage one, and I have my doubts about that as well. So, and this is what I was saying before about why I'm worried that this was set up to fail. The Israeli government set this up to fail. This is what they wanted, and it's going to be very hard to build something in Gaza that is better than what we're seeing now, and that isn't Hamas fighters walking around with their faces covered and holding machine guns. It's not it's not a fait accompli now until the end of time, but it's kind of too late now to do anything about it in the short term, at least.
So I agree with you on the point that it's too late now because you already paused the war and you have a lot less leverage on Hamas. So why would Hamas feel the need to relent on anything at the moment, right? Like we said, this deal is not that bad for Hamas, to say the least, and so you have much less leverage to actually institute some alternative into the Strip, or at least parts of the Strip. I think that's the key point. Not that you were going to kind of parachute in an alternative Palestinian, Arab, whatever force, because like we all know, there's still Hamas on the ground and still, by the way, they were battling Israeli forces until 3 days ago, but that you begin a process to at least walk back a lot of Hamas rule, or at least present an alternative to the people on the ground. An alternative not called IDF reoccupation and military rule, which I think we can all agree would be a disaster, although there are voices in this Israeli government who are calling for exactly that. I should also say I'm maybe a bit more optimistic about the first stage actually running to completion. I think Hamas has a good reason to at least keep the war paused for as long as possible. They don't want to see renewed fighting. And so even if negotiations for a second phase aren't going that well, I think the 6 weeks could run its course. For Israel too, obviously, you want to get as many hostages out as possible. So I don't know what reason Netanyahu has to blow up this deal, which he just agreed to at some political cost to him domestically.
I think that not that I'm predicting this will absolutely happen, but here's the argument for it getting blown up from the Israeli side. And as more hostages come back, and it starts to be bodies and not living hostages, and the more that Hamas fighters are openly parading around Gaza, I think that there's going to start to be a backlash inside of Israel where people say, forget about stage two. How can we possibly get to stage two? That'll cement Hamas in power in Gaza forever. How can we even keep this going when, now we're friars? Now they're handing back dead bodies and we're handing them security prisoners and they're parading around like they still own the place because they do. I think that's going to create pressure. And so, is it absolute that the deal is going to fall apart before the end of phase one? No, of course not. But I think that the imagery and the politics and the sentiment around this, which at the moment, of course, are as high as they're going to be given the scenes we saw yesterday, I think that is going to change.
Sorry, I'm just going to say that I also think that we have to remember, even now, right? First week of the deal, first stage of the deal, Hamas needed to do this to perfection. Ceasefire started late. They have not transferred there's an agreement that the list of hostages to be released in every step would be submitted a certain number of hours before. They didn't do this on time. Now this whole shenanigan of Saturday, Sunday. I mean, we have to remember that Hamas is going to give Israel excuses to say that the terms have been violated. It's going to happen. This is the DNA of the organization. It's happening already.
I think Hamas is going to play games, but I still maintain they have a strong interest to keep this deal running, at least in the first stage. Look, they're riding high right now, right? They're not getting bombed. They're regrouping inside Gaza. They're going after all the war profiteers and the clans and the collaborators that they suspect that were maybe aiding Israel or going against Hamas wishes over the past 15 months. This is literally their day in the sun. Their weeks in the sun right now after the last 15 months. So again, I know there's a debate inside Israel about what Hamas will do. Also, as Michael alluded to, what the Israeli government will do in response. But the point I was getting at before is that public sentiment is a fickle thing, right? Public sentiment could easily turn against the government and against Netanyahu if only bodies come out. Again, it remains to be seen, and hopefully that's not the case. But Netanyahu himself, and by the way, other people that we talk to, security officials, maintain that a large majority of the 33 on the list are still alive, and I hope that's the case. But if they're not, then that raises even more questions about how you agreed to this deal in the first place. And so the anger will be directed against the government. But that brings me to point number 2. I was at Hostage Square yesterday afternoon before the 3 women were released, and the overwhelming sentiment there. I spoke to relatives of hostages still in captivity. I spoke to just regular Israelis. Everyone wants to see phase 2. Everyone wants to see this continue. Maybe not the Israeli right and Bezalel Smotrich and maybe even Bibi Netanyahu, but people want to see the hostages come home, and that will likely require a successful negotiation for stage 2, which brings me to my next question. It took a year of very difficult negotiations to get at least this first stage, this kind of 6-week pause, essentially, in a partial hostage release. What are the prospects that you can thrash out a second stage negotiation and successful deal to end the war and get the rest of the hostages back, to do all that in 20 days, right? If it starts on day 16 of the first stage, basically in 2 weeks. Shira, what are the prospects that we're going to see a second stage? That's a big question on everyone's mind, obviously.
I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, and I did, but this was easier to predict. But as we're all waiting for Godot, Trump, he's in the White House, and I think a lot of it depends on what
you did last month.
His administration does, because if he just wanted to say, okay, I got a deal, I succeeded where Joe Biden didn't, there's no war, but not going to go, not put in the hard work that is really needed now on the ground, ensuring there's stage 2, they won't be a stage 2. This is it's all on him. It seems that his envoy Witkoff succeeded, and he's going to be coming here a lot. He's very, very involved. The mediators as well, and we'll see how they tailor this with also their other. They have other visions for this region, right? As I'm looking at, Qatar committing to increase substantially the aid into Gaza, sponsoring maybe this rehabilitation, or do we bring other parties, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, trying to expand the Abraham Accords, and for all of these things, it's very clear that Israel, at the very, very least, needs to end the war. So presenting a concrete plan and putting the pressure on Netanyahu and his government that this was not supposed to be a temporary deal. They meant it. That they want the end of the war, and basically building on this terrible crisis to carve out, for a diplomatic initiative, and that will require all the things that we've been saying all along. If that's going to happen, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's the rational thing, right? It makes sense that it would happen. Also, we're looking at Israeli polling. I think the public opinion here would be ready for this. Netanyahu is probably very happy that he got rid of Ben-Gvir in his coalition. He might be ready to change his government overall. Maybe Neri, I think you had this thought about his legacy. He's not a young man also.
Yeah.
There could be many considerations, but whether we everything comes together in 42 days, I'm not sure. Not sure at all.
Yeah. The legacy play, that's a longer term vision. That basically the idea that I've heard in some quarters is that basically, in 6 weeks or whenever, Netanyahu will cut a deal to end the war in Gaza, get all the hostages out, use that as a springboard for a Saudi deal, including a significant kind of Palestinian component or some process towards Palestinian statehood. Obviously, that will blow up Netanyahu's government, but the war by then will have been won, quote unquote. So the elections will be looming, and Netanyahu will retire off into the sunset with a Saudi peace deal and a plea bargain with his trial. That's one scenario. I don't know how likely it is, but that's something that definitely is up in the ether. Michael, take out your crystal ball. How strongly do you think Trump and his people will push for a successful stage 2 negotiation to end the war? And if that's the case, what will Netanyahu choose between Donald Trump and basically Bezalel Smotrich, right? Who's again and actually seriously threatened to resign if the war isn't restarted in 6 weeks.
It seems to me, at least from what we can see from the outside, that Trump's instinct is going to be to keep this going. He mentioned it in his inauguration speech today, right after. I mean, he had a very brief foreign policy section, but what he said was that his proudest legacy is going to be a peacemaker and a unifier. And then the one example he gave says just yesterday, where he says one day before he assumed office, the hostages are coming back home. So he's obviously very proud of this as an accomplishment. And I definitely don't think he wants to see fighting resume in Gaza and have to deal with the headache of an Israel-Hamas war or an Israel-Iran war or really any wars in the Middle East that are going to require U.S. involvement, not necessarily military involvement, but just all of the involvement that we've seen over the past 15 months from the United States in this conflict. So my guess is that his instinct is going to be to push to get to the next phase. And perhaps most importantly from this, then using that as a way to get an Israel-Saudi normalization deal, and he gets his Nobel Prize and is cemented as the ultimate Middle East peacemaker. Now, as we all know from watching this, despite the fact that in some ways getting to phase 1 almost seemed easy for the Trump folks. He sent Witkoff. Witkoff demanded Netanyahu meet him in his office on Shabbat when Netanyahu didn't want to, and all of a sudden, a couple of days later, Netanyahu was agreeing to the framework. I think that the longer these guys deal with Netanyahu, the more frustrated they're going to get, just like pretty much everybody who seems to be dealing with Netanyahu ever. I think that things are going to get bogged down in more and more details. The more complex it becomes. I also think that Netanyahu, over time, is going to find ways to frustrate Trump and his team the same way that he has frustrated every president he has dealt with. So, what Trump's preferences and what Netanyahu wants, I'm certain are going to be different. And the question will be, what is Trump's attention span? How much does he actually want to devote to this issue? What are they actually willing to do to lean on Netanyahu? Because I really don't think that simply being scared of Trump and his unpredictability or volatility is going to be enough to get Netanyahu to override all of the concerns he has, including concerns over his own politics and what it means for his cases and what it means for his tenure as prime minister. So these are all questions that cannot be answered on, we're 3.5 hours into Trump's first day. This will all emerge over time, but there's going to be some conflict between Trump and Netanyahu. This is what Trump wants to push for. And it's really going to be a question of attention span and leverage and how much they can actually get Netanyahu to move.
So tension and conflict between Netanyahu and Trump is a bad thing for Netanyahu. Let's be clear. It's a bad thing diplomatically. It's a bad thing politically here in Israel. Remains to be seen how much he wants to go head on with Trump. But like you said, it's early days, right? It's not even his first full day in office. I guess the likely outcome is some kind of clash between Trump and Netanyahu's domestic political considerations. But I'm very curious to see how Netanyahu tries to manage that. Knowing Netanyahu, I think he took the deal that started yesterday, and he's like, well, in 6 weeks we'll see what happens in 6 weeks. That maybe he himself doesn't have a clear idea of what he's going to do after 42 days. Maybe, like you said, he's given an out by Hamas, and Hamas does something egregious and blows up the deal, and Netanyahu has a ready excuse to go back to fighting. If you want my best guess, I think the stage 2 talks will probably not come to fruition. It's too high on order, especially for Israel, both to permanently end the war and also release some very, very heavy Palestinian prisoners. And Netanyahu may not want to completely blow up his current coalition, and so we're going to see a resumption of fighting, maybe more severe and fierce than we've seen in recent months. And then at a certain point, negotiations will restart, and knowing Netanyahu and maybe Ron Dermer, his close advisor, they're going to try to maybe leverage that into perhaps a better deal vis-a-vis Hamas in Gaza and to get the hostages out, or leverage it even further towards a Saudi deal. But I also am skeptical that there's going to be a fluid and smooth transition to a second stage, unfortunately.
And it's notable that Netanyahu, in his public comments the other day about the deal, he's basically already trying to box Trump in as much as he can by reiterating that he has Trump's green light to go back to war and go back to fighting if Hamas doesn't hold up its end. And I think he's clearly trying to set the stage here to keep all of his options open, which, as we know, he likes. So take that for what it is. I look at it as him telegraphing what he thinks he's going to end up doing in 6 weeks and maybe even before.
Shira, what do you think about Trump and Bibi and the relationship? Maybe not today, but in 6 weeks.
So first of all, I agree, and there are going to be a lot of tensions and different prioritization and attention to detail that is required, and a lot of heavy lifting. I don't know if this is where Trump is going to be. I also agree with you, Neri, about Netanyahu. Right? He's what he's best is playing for time, and this is again playing for time. This is why, by the way, right? If he really wanted to get to this to finish the deal, right, and get all the hostages back, he just needs to say end of war, and then we can get everyone back, and not every week, 3 or 4, depending, and then moving to phase 2, and maybe even
it would have just
3.
been it would have just been one stage, one deal. It wouldn't have been multiple stages.
Yes. End of war, which in practice, we've seen end of war. We didn't see end of fighting, but those raids that we've been in, and short of the last operation in Jabalia and Bet Hanun, we haven't seen major fighting in Gaza in month and many months, right? So just saying that. But this obviously is a problem with the coalition partners. So it depends on their relationship between them. It's interesting now that if you look at Trump's major Israeli Jewish supporters, obviously Miriam Edelson, and she broke. She's now supporting Naftali Bennett in major ways, and no longer Netanyahu as she used to. So it depends who whispers in Trump's ears. She is very hawkish, very pro-settlements. So she may want hostages, but in return, getting some concessions in the West Bank. By the way, we don't have time to speak about it now, but obviously it seems that settlers in the West Bank are torching Palestinian homes and cars on fire as we speak now, second day in a row. There's this. This also comes with a price in the other Palestinian territory, which we haven't mentioned. So there's going to be a lot of factors influencing their relationship. But Netanyahu clearly wanted to be on Trump's good side. I think I heard that he was the first leader to call to congratulate him upon entering office. I don't think he was the first to congratulate Biden.
No, he wasn't.
He also released his congratulatory video today before Trump was was even done speaking.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Definitely want to be on his good side, and let's hope Trump now has a lot of power, and let's hope he uses it to be the peacemaker that he claims to be.
It's the big unknown, what Trump actually wants and what he's willing to say and do and apply in this part of the world to get it done. And in terms of Netanyahu, it's just amazing contradiction. And in every one of his public statements in recent days, he says, we haven't given up on all our war goals, which means obviously destroying or eliminating Hamas in Gaza, and returning all of our hostage home. Now, returning all of our hostages home requires seeing the deal out to completion. And that, by definition, will likely require not the total victory, not the complete elimination of Hamas in Gaza. And so there's this contradiction between his public statements and really his public strategy. And then in terms of the price, we know for a fact that Bezalel Smotrich, in return for staying in government and, yes, opposing and voting against this catastrophic deal, as he called it, got various things in the West Bank. And I'm fairly certain we're going to see a major IDF operation across the West Bank very soon, because that's what Smotrich wanted, and that's what Netanyahu gave him.
By the way, let's not forget, he also got the release of 5 Jews in administrative detention suspected of committing terrorism without anybody signing off on it. They just were let go quietly on Friday night.
Yeah, well, that's also the wonders of the new defense minister, who's does what Netanyahu wants and is not necessarily an independent thinker like the previous defense minister. So yes, that was part of the package that was given to Smotrich, and we're going to see. I hate to say it, we're likely going to see escalation in the West Bank as there's a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, which is as stupid as it sounds, frankly. So remains to be seen. And by the way, the whole issue of Netanyahu and Trump, we know that he received guarantees from Trump, and by the way, also from Biden, that Israel would be allowed to resume fighting if Hamas violates the deal, which is fine in terms of the first stage. If Hamas violates the deal and doesn't hold up its end of the bargain, then yes, that's fine. And also the first stage is very clearly demarcated. It's a very complex and detailed agreement. There's no agreement for the second stage. So what does it mean, Hamas violating the terms of the deal, if the two parties haven't come to an agreement about the second stage? Still not clear about that.
Right. And Neri, I do think it is important, because when Netanyahu speaks about the guarantees he received, and when the discussion here is we can go back to fighting, the conversation in Israel here leaves out the part of the if Hamas violates the terms. I think here there's a sense that we can just go back to fighting whenever we decide, but this is not the agreement, or this is not what both Biden and Trump agreed to.
If Hamas violates
so it also
the terms
depends
of the deal.
on what Hamas. Yeah. So it also depends, and if Hamas doesn't violate the deal. Not
right.
unlikely.
And if there's no agreement,
and
if there's no agreement on a second stage, and we get to day 43, then is Israel allowed to go back to fighting? I'll take that silence.
The interpretation is an absolute yes. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the interpretation also.
That might be the interpretation here, and that's what the Prime Minister's office is trying to sell. I don't know if that's necessarily what the Americans wrote to the Israeli government. It's a good question. We wanted to get into the ins and outs and looking ahead at Donald Trump's Middle East policy, but there will be 4 years to get into all of that. So buckle up, but we're going to have to leave it there. Michael and Shira, thank you as always for your precious time these days, and let's hope for days like yesterday in the coming weeks, positive days, hopeful days, joyous days, and for more for more Israelis to get out of the Gaza Strip safely and securely.
Yes, and to quote our new president in that spirit, happy Liberation Day to you both.
Yes, I don't know.
Yes, indeed.
Amen, inshallah.
Amen. And yesterday it was Liberation Day for 3 Israelis. So we'll take it in a more positive spin as opposed to what I think the new and current U.S. president likely meant it. So thank you both. Talk to you soon.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again to Michael Koplow and Shira Efron as always. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening.